Hello, and today we're going to be going over the November December 2025 public forum topic. This one's about encrypted access to information. Let's kind of break it down a little bit before we get into there. There's a couple of important parts to this one that you need to be aware of. First, we're going to go over what an encrypted communication is, and then it's also important to understand what lawful access is because that's kind of different. At its heart, this is about whether or not technology companies should be required to provide law enforcement access to encrypted communications. So, those are communications that have effectively been turned into code so that they're not as easy to read. At its heart, this is all about, and I'll go into this a little bit later on, competing values, security and privacy, or if you want to like couch it differently, security and liberty. So, even though this topic might seem like a little bit technological at the beginning, it's actually not that difficult to wrap your mind around. Encryption is just simply the process of changing what would be otherwise understandable words and letters into numbers or different codes. To unencrypt something, you just need the key or a program that can do it. It's not a particularly difficult process. Hackers do this all the time. So really there's like two different types. There's recoverable and there's unrecoverable. If you have a recoverable encryption, then it provides access to the third party that can simply unscramble it and see what the message is. Critically, that's in response to warrant without the cooperation of the senders and recipients. So, again, if you are going to be arguing for security, you want to be arguing for recoverable encryption. If you're going to be arguing for privacy or liberty, then you want to be arguing for unrecoverable encryption. And this is actually what WhatsApp uses right now. For this, no one, and I mean not even the service provider themselves, can actually unencrypt it, which means the company can't change it back into understandable sentences and words. There's nothing that they can do about it. To kind of quickly go over the history here, back in 2000, the US removed restrictions onto the sale of strong encryption products that the like National Security Agency and the FBI couldn't break into, under the reasoning that letting people use strong encryption would ultimately kind of make the internet safer. Most people honestly didn't use this form of encryption at the time because it was really difficult and impracticable. Now, one of the major things that starts to happen in the later 2000s is something that's referred to, and his pictures up there, is the Snowden leak. So, Edward Snowden is able to essentially get out of the United States with a variety of what we would call state secrets. And he flees to a variety of different countries, including Russia at one point. And he releases the information, which is embarrassing to the United States government. And what it showed, a lot of this information was that, believe it or not, even though no one had actually been using strong encryption, that the United States government had actually been spying on its own citizens. And the moment that people wake up to this in the mid 2000s, there's a lot of concerns about the American government and American companies facilitating government surveillance. And those concerns only continue to grow. To address these concerns, some companies immediately adopted unrecoverable encryption that did not permit law enforcement requests to go forward. And so that's when you start to see this really major shift in the direction of unrecoverable encryption. So we're talking about a very, very, very relatively new phenomenon. And that's something that's worth noting, I think, honestly, for both sides. Next, for a second, I want to go ahead and talk about what is lawful access because I think that there's a couple of different things here that could happen. To ensure lawful access to content on unrecoverable encryption, there's a couple of potential ways that I think that the government could get this done. One is that you could just restrict the design, sale, production, et cetera, of unrecoverable encryption through just banning that form altogether. That would be like a step one, just kind of like move forward. I think that's the only one that honestly works in this case, especially, if you're going to be the F. So if you're going to argue in favor of this restriction, I think that that's the direction that you have to go. You have to argue that the only way to actually make this work would be for the government to restrict the production of unrestricted encryption. That's the only way to make it function as a reasonable basis. Because the other argument would be, okay, well, let's just allow lawful hacking, which is kind of an oxymoron. Lawful hacking is essentially the expansion of law enforcement capabilities so that they're able to get access to unrestricted encryption without any sort of cooperation from the sender, the receiver, or possibly even the company itself. The problem with this is a couple of things. First of all, it's actually not the prompt. The prompt says lawful access. And so I think you run into a problem right away that someone can simply respond, that's not part of the prompt. You're not allowed to change the prompt or the resolution, and therefore you can't argue for lawful hacking just from the rules standpoint. But there's two other problems with this. If we were to go down the road in the United States of allowing the FBI, CIA, and others to pursue lawful hacking so that they get access to all this encrypted data, regardless as to whether or not anyone says yes or no, and quite frankly, maybe without even their knowledge, then governments could access international data. So the United States government could start looking at data from people's phones if they live in the United Kingdom or Australia or India or China, of course. You also can't assume efficacy. You can't assume that this is just going to work. Like, that's not something that you're allowed to fiat in these sorts of debates. So I think it's important to recognize that lawful hacking has a lot of drawbacks to it, and I would not argue it in this prompt. I don't think that it's the right direction to go, and quite frankly, I think it's against the spirit of the actual debate. What is this debate about, though? At the end of the day, this is a value-based debate. In our previous topic in September and October, we were talking about the United Kingdom rejoining the EU. And most competitors were fighting over the same ground, which is economics. Which is better for economics in this case? Are you better off rejoining the EU or going it alone? And a lot of this came down to time frame. This one is very different. I don't see the two sides in this specific topic fighting over the same territory. Rather, I think this comes down to a question of whose value can be argued better. Okay. And so, what we're talking about here is a distinction between privacy on one hand and security on the other. So, the resolution is the United States federal government should require technology companies to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. So, if you are arguing for the AF on this, you are definitely arguing for security, the AF or Pro. I use those interchangeably. All right. Because the goal of this, as we're going to get into in the two sides in just a second, is all about this idea that security is the most important thing and can protect us going forward. And to do that, the government needs access to this information so they can prevent bad actors from doing bad things. Now, that's going to be if you're on the pro side. If you're on the con side, you're going to argue no. Fundamental concerns about liberty and privacy trump anything about security. You're going to have to argue that as important as security is, we cannot allow the government to start accessing people's private data and information, because to do that is a step towards authoritarianism. And I think that that's really the argument that you have to make. So it's much more couched in American ideals and values. Whereas if you're the pro, you can just your argument's a little bit more straightforward. You can just say security trumps everything else. So let's look at a couple of the arguments. So I think that there can be a few, but quite frankly, I would probably just advance one contention, which is national security. Under a national security argument, encryption shields illegal behavior. Like, there's so many examples, and I'm not going to go through all of the evidence here today, but it's worth noting that, quite frankly, there's child trafficking, there's drug deals, there's potential terrorism. All of these sorts of things are actually shielded because people can use encrypted software. Um, Let me give you an example. In 2015, there was a terrorist attack at San Bernardino, but the FBI didn't have access to one of the attacker's encrypted iPhones, and Apple refused to provide access, leading to a long court battle. Although the FBI did actually ultimately create a backdoor without resolving the case, the situation kind of exposed the problem. And that problem is encryption does prevent law enforcement from accessing critical intelligence that could prevent future attacks. And I'll get to that in just a second because I think that that's actually the more important argument here. But you could also argue that simply law doesn't keep up with technology. Technology changes at a much, much, much faster pace than the law does. And all this resolution would do would be to bring the law back up to speed with a technology that has significantly outpaced it. But I don't think that really matters in the end. I think what really matters is the third point here, which is deterrence. Because you can argue that law enforcement needs it to investigate crimes, which has already happened. And I think that that's important, but I do think that's limited. And I think it's limited because the impact is much, much, much smaller. Whereas if you can focus the argument on deterrence, on the idea that the FBI, CIA, law enforcement, and others, if they get access to encrypted data, they can prevent terrorist attacks or other crimes from happening, your impact is so much bigger in that case because you're able to stop a crime from happening, just not just simply investigate what has happened and talk about who has been harmed. You can prevent harm from occurring, and that's the direction that I think the pro really needs to go here. There's also an interesting consumer protection argument here, but I don't know how much you honestly want to go into this. It doesn't really fall under security. And honestly, there would be no reason for the United States government to actually advocate for this. They could, but it doesn't really fall under anything that they do. Lawful access, if you allowed companies to do this, it would help data recovery, and they could save millions, maybe even billions of dollars for almost no cost. But it doesn't actually have anything to do with security. So I could keep this in my back pocket as a unique argument that you need, but not something that I would ever lead with under any circumstance. All right, let's talk about the con. The con is all going to be about right to privacy under these circumstances. At the end of the day, encryption exists to protect individuals who want to share and express information without the fear of exposure. And for this one, I think it does make sense to try to do a comparison with another country. China is the most obvious in this circumstance because China is a surveillance state. They utilize a variety of different technological tools to try to make sure that their populace is not doing anything against the CCP. And so you can use them as a foil here as much as possible. And I think that that makes sense. And again, you want to go back and you want to argue as much as humanly possible American ideals of liberty. This has also already been echoed a lot by the United States Supreme Court. That's USCT. For example, in Carpenter versus the United States, which is a 2018 case, the court held that the government had to obtain a warrant before accessing cell site location information, which recognized that digital data could reveal a lot more about people's private lives than old forms of surveillance. And you can use those arguments to point out that if you were to pass this, it would allow the government to do a lot of things that they frankly couldn't have done hundreds of years before, which could allow you to go back to a traditionalist view of the Constitution if you want to do the Constitution argument. It's also a great slippery slope argument because if we start to argue that, well, if we allow law enforcement to do this under the guise of national security, who defines what national security is? It's going to go a long way to deciding who actually gets to have access to what. You could very easily see a politician nowadays running for office and saying, I'm going to enforce national security, only to actually use these tools to attack their political enemies. And so I think if you can use it in that way, and there's a lot of examples nowadays of how this could happen right now. I think that that gives you a much stronger argument under the circumstances. There's also a lot of cybersecurity concerns for this, folks. And this is all about trade offs because, look, anytime you open a back door, you are opening up a weakness. So, right now, if we allow complete encryption that governments don't have access to and that even the providers don't have access to, those pieces of information, those are safe. But as soon as we start to create keys, they become inherently less safe because the moment that law enforcement is able to access something, you can bet that hackers, terrorists, and other criminals are going to start to work on ways to use those same tools to their advantage. And so you have a decent cybersecurity argument here if you'd like to advance it, though I think privacy is probably your best one. This is a couple of last little ones. The US has become a leader in tech because it lacks government access requirements. And again, this is a great situation where you can use a foil like a China, like an Iran, something like that, and argue that the reason that we don't see these apps oftentimes being used in the Western world coming out of these places, you could even use Russia, is because many of those states that are authoritarian in nature do require government access to encrypted data. And that would be a problem for the United States if it would go down the same path, because people just wouldn't trust those apps as much as they would ordinarily. I think I would maybe shoehorn this one into privacy, particularly if you're going to bring up China. I think it opens up another avenue of attack. The economic consequences of this could be massive, as well as a potential for international conflict, because now, as I mentioned earlier, if the United States government is able to look into encrypted data, especially if it's just, even, let's just say it's even in the United States. Well, you have people traveling in the United States who are not United States citizens. And so you could have a scenario where maybe you have a diplomat from France who is present, or maybe you have the CEO of a major company. And the United States government now decides, well, we're going to look at this person's text messages. We're going to look at this person's information because it would have been encrypted otherwise, and now it's not. That could open the door for a lot of conflict, as you can probably imagine. Now, you can also kind of argue, if you're the con, that this just isn't effective, but this is not a contention. Don't lead with that. That this is a rebuttal response. All right. And I think you could simply argue that the pro just oversells the argument that this is actually going to fix anything. Again, if you go back to the idea that the law can't keep up with technology, well, if you pass a law about encrypted technologies, odds are someone else is going to come up with something else very quickly that's going to do the exact same thing that is not going to provide the United States access. And whoops, there we go. We're in the same situation again. Plus, no matter what the United States does, it cannot mandate similar policies in other countries. So it's not like criminal and terrorist organizations in other countries are just going to suddenly provide their information to the United States government. So unless a terrorist plot is being hatched on US soil where the United States FBI would actually have access to that device, there still isn't anything that they can do about it. Again, this is not an argument of its own, but I do think it's an effective argument if you wanted to rebut what the other side was saying. So, but in the end, I think this comes down to the pro side really arguing security, the con side arguing privacy, and whoever is able to maximize the impact of their value, I think carries the day.